Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. Jason turned off the engine and stayed in the car. The parking lot was almost empty. A few lights buzzed overhead, throwing pale circles onto the asphalt. Somewhere nearby, a tree moved in the wind, its leaves brushing against each other in a slow, uneven rhythm. He should have gone inside. His apartment was only a short walk away. But he stayed where he was, hands resting on the steering wheel, shoulders slightly hunched forward as if he were still bracing for something. Jason was 23, a community college student still figuring out what he was supposed to become. Lately, it felt like everyone else had already decided. Friends posting graduation photos, new jobs, new cities, new lives that looked clean and confident from the outside. He hadn't failed. Not exactly. But he hadn't arrived anywhere either. Jason glanced at his phone on the passenger seat face down. He already knew what was there. Notifications he didn't want to open. Photos he didn't want to compare himself to. Timelines that made his own life feel stalled. He looked away and focused instead on the tree near the edge of the lot. It was old, thick trunk, wide branches reaching out in every direction. The kind of tree that didn't look like it had ever been in a hurry. Its roots must have been deep by now, spreading out beneath the concrete in ways no one could see. Jason watched it sway slightly in the breeze and felt something tighten in his chest. Earlier that day, he'd been in a small garden section of a hardware store, killing time before class. He hadn't meant to stop there. He just wandered in, drawn by the quiet. On a low shelf near the back, he'd noticed a row of bonsai trees, each one carefully shaped, trimmed, wired into a precise form. they were beautiful, controlled, finished. He remembered thinking how neat they looked, how intentional, how impressive it must be to grow something so perfectly contained. Now, sitting in his car, he thought about the difference between those bonsai trees and the old one in front of him. Both alive, both real, but grown under very different conditions. Jason rested his forehead lightly against the steering wheel. The car was still warm from the drive. The faint smell of plastic and dust filled the space. He'd spent the last year feeling like a bonsai in the wrong pot, trimmed too often, compared too closely, constantly adjusted to fit a shape he wasn't even sure he wanted. Every time he thought about taking a different path, a quieter voice in his head would pull him back. "You're falling behind. You should be further along by now." That voice sounded practical, reasonable. It rarely yelled. It just kept pointing out how much taller other people seemed. Jason straightened up and rolled his shoulders, trying to release some of the tension that had been building there all evening. His breath came shallow at first, then slowly deepened as he sat there longer. The old tree outside didn't care how tall it looked compared to anything else. It wasn't measured against a timeline. It didn't apologize for growing slowly or unevenly. It simply took up the space it had been given year after year. Jason realized how often he'd assumed there was a single right shape for a life. Graduate by this age, earn this much, know this clearly who you are. Anything outside that shape felt like a mistake. But what if some lives weren't meant to be trimmed small and tidy? What if some needed time, space, messy seasons where nothing looked impressive from the outside? He opened the car door and stepped out. The air felt cooler, immediately brushing against his face and arms. He walked a few steps toward the tree, stopping at the edge of the parking lot. Up close, the bark was rough, uneven. Scars from years of weather insects, repairs the tree had done on its own. Jason reached out and rested his palm against the trunk. It felt solid, grounded, alive. The tree hadn't grown like this by accident. It had grown like this because it had been allowed to. Jason closed his eyes for a moment and let himself breathe. Not deeply on purpose, just enough to feel the air move in and out of his chest without resistance. Maybe he wasn't late. Maybe he wasn't behind. Maybe he was just not meant to grow in a shallow container. The thought didn't solve anything. It didn't give him a plan. But it loosened something inside him, the way loosening a tight knot doesn't fix the rope but makes it usable again. Jason stepped back, gave the tree one last look, and headed toward his apartment. The night felt quieter now, less judgmental. Not because his life had changed, but because the way he was measuring it had softened. Some things aren't small because they're weak. Some things are small because someone keeps cutting them back, and some things, given enough room, grow exactly as they're meant to. Jason didn't turn on the lights when he entered the apartment. The faint glow from the parking lot slipped in through the window, enough to see the outlines of furniture, enough to move without effort. He set his keys down on the counter and left his shoes by the door, not lining them up the way he usually did. Tonight didn't feel like a night for adjustments. He sat on the edge of the couch and let his back curve forward naturally, elbows resting on his thighs. His phone stayed in his pocket. For once, he didn't feel pulled toward it. The comparisons it held felt distant now, like something that belonged to another room. The image of the old tree stayed with him, not as a lesson, not as an idea to apply, but as a feeling in his body. The weight of the trunk, the steadiness, the sense of time moving slowly, without apology. Jason noticed how often his life had felt like it was being shaped from the outside. Grades, expectations, advice offered with good intentions, all of it trimming, wiring, redirecting. None of it meant to harm him, and yet something in him had been quietly resisting for a long time. He leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. A small crack ran across it, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He had lived here for months before ever seeing it. Now it seemed almost comforting proof that things didn't need to be flawless to hold. The old tree outside hadn't asked to be admired. It hadn't worried about being impressive. It had grown because it was alive, because the ground beneath it was deep enough, because no one had tried to make it smaller to fit a shelf. Jason felt his breathing slow as that thought settled. Not intentionally, not as a technique, just a natural response to not being measured for a moment. He thought about the bonsai trees again, how much care they required, how carefully they were pruned, shaped, constrained. They weren't wrong, they were beautiful in their own way. But they needed constant attention to remain that way. Maybe some lives thrived on structure and careful shaping, and maybe others needed seasons of uneven growth stretches where nothing looked tidy or finished. Maybe comparing one to the other had never made sense in the first place. Jason shifted his weight and felt the couch cushion rise and fall beneath him. The room was quiet enough that he could hear his own breath, steady and unforced. The tension he'd been carrying in his chest earlier had softened like a muscle finally allowed to rest. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel resolved. What he felt was simpler than that. He felt allowed to grow slowly, allowed to change direction, allowed not to know yet. The pressure to arrive somewhere specific eased its grip. Not gone, just quieter, less convincing. It no longer sounded like truth, more like a habit losing momentum. Jason stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the parking lot. The tree was still there, barely visible now, its shape blending into the dark. He didn't need to see it clearly to know it was standing. Some growth happens where no one is watching. Some strength comes from being left alone. He turned away from the window and moved toward the bedroom. The floor was cool under his feet. The bed welcomed him without resistance, sheets folding easily around his weight. He lay on his side and let his arms rest where they fell. There was nothing he needed to plan tonight, nothing he needed to compare. Tomorrow could handle itself. As his eyes grew heavy, Jason noticed one last thing. The feeling of being behind had been replaced by something quieter. A sense of being exactly where he was without judgment attached. Not small, not late, just growing in his own way. The old tree didn't rush the night, and neither did he. The room settled. The thoughts thinned. The measuring stopped. And in the dark, with no one watching, something inside him continued to grow slowly, naturally, without needing to prove itself at all. The train rocked gently as it pulled away from the platform, a low metallic rhythm, settling in beneath everything else. Priya stood near the door, at first holding the pole with one hand, her bag resting against her hip. The car wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. People were spaced out in their own small bubbles. Eyes down, headphones on each body, moving with the shared motion of the ride. She found an open seat by the window and sat tucking her feet slightly under the bench. Outside, the city slid past in layers brick, glass, concrete, then a blur of lights as the train picked up speed. The motion was familiar enough to be comforting, but not enough to feel like home. Priya was 28 and worked as a data analyst for a company she liked well enough. The work made sense to her. Patterns, numbers, quiet focus. It was the rest of life that often felt harder to place. Conversations that moved too fast. Rooms where everyone else seemed to know where they belonged. Decisions that felt heavier than they looked on paper. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool window glass and watched her reflection drift in and out over the darkening city. It always surprised her how clearly she could feel present and out of place at the same time, like she was there doing everything required but slightly off-center, as if she'd arrived without the final instruction. The train slowed near the next stop, brakes sighing softly. A few people stood to leave. Others took their seats. The space adjusted around her without asking. Earlier that day, Priya had been in a meeting where everyone spoke easily, tossing ideas back and forth like they were all holding the same map. She had followed along, contributed when needed, nodded at the right moments. No one excluded her. No one questioned her place. And still, when the meeting ended, she'd felt the familiar tug of doubt. A quiet sense that she was filling a seat that belonged to someone else, that eventually someone would notice the mismatch. She pulled her jacket closer around herself, not because she was cold, but because the pressure felt grounding. The train swayed again, steady and predictable, as if reminding everyone inside that they were being carried whether they tried to control it or not. Priya thought about a puzzle she'd worked on as a kid, one of those with hundreds of pieces scattered across the table. She remembered the feeling of scanning the shapes, convinced there had to be one missing. She'd checked the box, the floor under the couch. Only later did she realize the piece had been there the whole time, just turned the wrong way. That memory surfaced now without effort as the train moved her through tunnels and open air. She wondered how many times she'd treated herself like a missing piece when she was simply not yet oriented. The train emerged above ground lights spilling in through the windows. Buildings gave way to trees for a few moments, their branches streaking past. The rhythm of the ride smoothed her breathing without her noticing. In and out. Slow, uncounted breaths. Priya watched the people across from her. A woman scrolling through her phone. A man staring at the floor, jaw relaxed. Someone humming quietly beneath their breath. None of them seemed to be proving anything. None of them looked like they were trying to justify their presence on the train. They were just here. She felt a soft ache behind her ribs, the kind that came from wanting to belong without knowing where to place that want. For years, she'd believed belonging was something you earned by fitting in just right, saying the right things, choosing the right path, becoming a version of yourself that made sense to everyone else. But the train didn't ask for that. It didn't care who deserved a seat. It simply moved, carrying every passenger equally regardless of their stories. Priya shifted slightly and let her shoulders drop. The tension there eased just a fraction. She didn't feel suddenly included. She didn't feel whole in a dramatic way. What she felt was quieter. She felt less separate. The train slowed again, pulling into another station. Doors opened. Air rushed in. A few passengers stepped out. Others stepped in. The shape of the car changed, but the ride continued. Priya realized then how often she'd imagined herself as an extra piece, one that didn't quite fit anywhere. But nothing here felt like extra. The train had room, the bench had room, the moment had room. She rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. The window reflected her face again, softer now, less questioned. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to solve herself before the next stop. Maybe she wasn't missing. Maybe she was already part of the picture, even if she couldn't see the full image yet. The thought stayed with her as the train carried her forward, steady and patient, into whatever came next. The train continued on, carrying Priya through neighborhoods she recognized and others she only knew by name. The movement was steady now, familiar enough that her body no longer braced for it. She rested back against the seat and let the window support the side of her head, watching lights pass in long, gentle streaks. She noticed how her thoughts had slowed. Not disappeared, just softened around the edges. They no longer lined up to argue her place in the world. They floated in and out like reflections on the glass, present, but not demanding. For most of her life, Priya had believed belonging was something external, a place you arrived at, a group that opened itself to you. A moment when everything finally clicked and you could say, "This is where I fit." Until then, she assumed she was incomplete, waiting for the missing piece that would make the picture whole. But sitting on the train surrounded by strangers who were not really strangers at all, she felt something shift. No one here knew her story. No one needed to. And still she was carried just the same. The idea settled quietly. Maybe belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into a shape. Maybe it was about being held, even temporarily, by the same movement, the same moment, the same direction. The train dipped back underground, the windows turning into mirrors again. Priya caught her reflection and studied it without judgment. The face looking back didn't appear unfinished. It looked attentive, alive, in motion. She thought again about that childhood puzzle, about how the piece she'd been searching for had never been gone, only turned the wrong way. How easy it was to mistake orientation for absence. How often she'd done the same with herself. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She didn't reach for it. Whatever it was could wait. Right now, there was nothing she needed to confirm. The train slowed, then picked up speed again. The sound of wheels against rails created a low, even rhythm, almost like breathing. Priya matched her breath to it without trying. In, out, carried forward. She felt the familiar urge to evaluate herself begin to fade. Not because she had answered all her questions, but because the questions no longer felt urgent. There would be time for them later, if they mattered at all. When the announcement for her stop played, she didn't feel the usual jolt of uncertainty. She stood, moved toward the door, and stepped off with the others. The platform was cool and quiet, the air heavier than inside the car. The train doors closed behind her, and with a soft, mechanical sigh, it continued on without pause. Priya watched it disappear into the tunnel lights, shrinking until there was only darkness again. She felt a small pang then, not of loss, but of recognition. The train hadn't left her behind. It had simply completed its role. She walked up the stairs and out into the night. The street above was calm, washed in yellow light. A few people passed by, each absorbed in their own direction. No one questioned her presence. No one measured her pace. As she walked home, Priya realized something else. She had spent years trying to locate the place where she would finally belong, as if it were fixed and waiting. But belonging wasn't stationary. It moved. It shifted. It appeared wherever she allowed herself to be fully present without shrinking. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, setting her bag down gently. The apartment greeted her with familiar silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it stay quiet. Priya sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her body felt heavier now, in the way it does when it trusts the ground beneath it. The day loosened its grip. The doubts that usually followed her into the evening didn't seem to know where to land. She didn't suddenly feel complete in a dramatic sense, but she no longer felt like a piece waiting to be found. She lay down and let her breath settle. The image of the puzzle faded, replaced by something simpler. A sense of being part of a larger movement, even without seeing the whole picture. Nothing needed to click into place tonight. Nothing needed to be resolved. Priya closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest inside the truth that had been there all along. She had never been missing. She had always been part of the whole. Carla noticed the crack while she was washing dishes. It wasn't new. That was the strange part. The small ceramic bowl had been chipped for a long time, a thin line running from the rim down one side, like a quiet scar. She had used it dozens of times without really seeing it. Tonight, under the warm kitchen light, it caught her attention. She slowed her hands in the sink, letting the water run over the bowl. The crack darkened slightly as it filled, then lightened again as the water drained away. The sound of the faucet was steady, familiar, the kind of sound that made the rest of the house feel calmer. Carla was 48 and worked as a hairstylist. All day she stood behind people adjusting smoothing, making small corrections so others could leave feeling more put together than when they arrived. She was good at it. She had learned how to notice tiny details and fix them gently without drawing attention to the flaw. It rarely occurred to her to do the same for herself. She turned the bowl in her hands, studying the crack more closely now. It wasn't jagged. It didn't threaten to break apart. It simply existed, part of the bowl's shape, part of its history. Earlier that evening, a client had laughed and said, "You're so confident, I wish I was more like you." Carla had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did. Confidence felt like the wrong word. She felt capable, yes, reliable, but confident implied something unbroken, something smooth. Carla set the bowl in the drying rack and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, her eyes drifted to the stack of mismatched dishes on the counter. None of them were perfect. Small chips, faded patterns, items collected over years rather than chosen all at once. She had always liked it that way. A kitchen that looked lived in. And yet, when it came to herself, she held a different standard. She noticed every crack, every place where she felt she should have healed faster, known better, been stronger by now. The faucet clicked off. The kitchen settled into a deeper quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. Carla leaned her hip against the counter and let her shoulders relax forward. She thought about the word flawed, how easily it attached itself to people. How often she had described herself that way in her own head, as if a crack automatically meant something was damaged beyond use. Carla picked the bowl up again and held it at eye level. The light caught the glaze unevenly along the crack, creating a faint line of reflection. It wasn't ugly. If anything, it made the bowl more interesting, more honest. She remembered something she had read years ago about old pottery in Japan. How cracks were sometimes repaired with gold, not to hide the break, but to highlight it. The idea had stayed with her, even if she couldn't remember the name for it. The bowl in her hands hadn't been repaired with gold. No one had tried to make the crack beautiful. And still, it held water. It held food. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Carla felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came when she thought about her own past. Relationships that hadn't lasted. Choices she replayed late at night, the quiet belief that if she were less marked, life would have gone more smoothly. She set the bowl back down carefully and rested both palms on the counter. The surface was cool, solid, trustworthy. She took a slow breath and let it out without shaping it. What if being whole didn't mean being uncracked? What if it simply meant being able to hold what life placed inside you? The thought didn't demand an answer. It stayed there like the bowl on the counter, waiting to be noticed. Carla turned off the kitchen light and left the room dim, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. The crack in the bowl was harder to see now, but she knew it was still there. And for the first time that evening, that didn't feel like a problem. Carla left the kitchen and moved into the living room, not turning on any more lights. The house felt different in the dimness, softer, less demanding. Shadows settled into corners without being asked to explain themselves. She sat down on the couch and let her back sink into the cushions, arms resting where they fell. The image of the bowl stayed with her, not as a symbol she needed to analyze, but as a quiet presence, something ordinary that had done its job without pretending to be untouched. She thought about how often she had treated her own life as if it were supposed to look unused. No visible wear, no chips, no signs that anything had ever pressed too hard. And when the marks showed up anyway, she'd taken them as evidence of failure instead of evidence of living. Carla crossed her legs and leaned her head back against the couch. The fabric was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of use. She liked that about it. It held her without trying to impress her. She remembered moments she usually avoided thinking about. Times she had trusted too much, stayed too long, left too early. None of them felt sharp tonight. They felt distant, like old weather that had already passed through. The bowl hadn't cracked because it was weak. It had cracked because it had been used, held heat, held weight, been part of countless small moments that mattered enough to leave a trace. Carla felt something ease in her chest as that understanding settled. She didn't need to repair herself to be acceptable. She didn't need to hide the places where life had pressed in. Those places didn't cancel her usefulness. They explained it. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, drawn there without urgency. The bowl sat quietly in the drying rack, a thin line visible along its side. Carla lifted it again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was steady, reliable. She filled it with water and carried it carefully to the sink. The bowl held the water without leaking, without protest. The crack didn't compromise its purpose. It simply told a story. Carla set the bowl down and turned off the remaining light. The kitchen faded into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of shapes she knew well. She didn't need to see everything clearly to trust it. In the bedroom, she changed into something soft and loose movements, slow, unhurried. The mirror caught her reflection briefly. She didn't look away. She didn't search for flaws. She just saw a woman who had been shaped by years of showing up. Carla lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, letting the weight settle across her shoulders. Her breathing slowed naturally, without direction. The day began to loosen its hold. She thought again of the pottery repaired with gold, the way cracks were honored instead of hidden. Not because suffering was beautiful, but because survival was honest. Maybe wholeness wasn't about returning to an unmarked state. Maybe it was about holding everything past present memory without falling apart. Carla felt her thoughts grow quieter, edges blurring. The crack no longer felt like something that needed attention. It simply existed, integrated, complete in its own way. The house rested around her, familiar and imperfect. The night moved forward without expectation. Somewhere the bowl waited in the kitchen, ready to be used again tomorrow. Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, without fixing, without correcting, without pretending to be unbroken. Nothing needed to be repaired tonight. Nothing needed to be hidden. She drifted toward sleep whole, not because she was flawless, but because she was still here, still holding still enough. Some mornings don't arrive with energy. They arrive quietly, almost shy, like they're not sure if anyone is ready for them yet. Tyler was already awake when the light started to thin the darkness between the trees. He hadn't set an alarm. He rarely did on days like this. As a park ranger, his schedule shifted with the seasons, with weather, with things that didn't care much about clocks. That morning he stood on a narrow trail just before sunrise, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, breath visible for a moment, and then gone. The forest was still. Not silent exactly, but waiting. The kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Tyler took a few slow steps forward, boots pressing into damp soil. Somewhere above him, a bird began to sing. Just one. A thin, clear sound, unhurried, unafraid of being heard or not heard. It didn't repeat itself for effect. It didn't pause to see if anyone was listening. It simply sang the way it always did because that was what it did when the morning came. Tyler stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. His body just did it on its own. He stood there, head tilted slightly, listening. Another bird joined in, then another, each with its own rhythm, its own tone. None of them tried to match the others. None of them waited for permission. They weren't performing. They weren't proving anything. They weren't hoping for applause. They were just being birds. Tyler felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight. It wasn't a dramatic release, no wave of emotion, just a subtle shift, like when you unclench your jaw after holding it all night. Lately, he'd been carrying a quiet question around with him, one he didn't talk about much. It showed up when he scrolled through his phone at night, when he heard old friends talk about promotions or big moves or what's next. The question wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Am I doing enough? Enough on paper. His life was fine. Steady job, decent health, a small apartment close to the park. He liked his work. He believed in it. But sometimes, especially in moments of comparison, that didn't seem to count for much. The world was loud about success, about recognition, about being seen. And Tyler wasn't sure where someone like him fit into that noise. Another bird sang closer this time. Tyler smiled, almost without realizing it. Not because the sound was impressive, but because it was honest. The bird wasn't trying to be louder than the rest of the forest. It wasn't trying to stand out. It was simply responding to the morning. Tyler thought about how often he did the opposite. How often he checked to see if what he was doing mattered before he let himself enjoy it. How often he measured his days by reaction instead of by presence. How many times he'd waited for someone else to notice before he allowed himself to feel okay about where he was. The bird didn't wait. It sang again, the same simple phrase, as if nothing else in the world required its attention. Tyler leaned against a nearby tree, the bark cool through his jacket. He closed his eyes for a moment. The forest continued without him. The light shifted. The air moved. Nothing stopped just because he did. There was something oddly comforting about that. He realized that the birds weren't singing for the forest. They were singing from themselves, from whatever instinct or joy or necessity lived inside them. They didn't seem concerned with how their song landed. They didn't adjust their pitch to be more likable. They didn't question whether they deserved to be heard. They sang because singing was part of being alive. Tyler took a slow breath in, then out. The breath felt easier than it had earlier, like it didn't have to pass through as many tight places to get out. He thought about the small things he loved that no one ever clapped for. Early mornings like this, fixing trail signs, watching fog lift off the ground, listening to the woods wake up. None of it earned praise. None of it went online. But it filled something real in him. Maybe value didn't have to be loud. Maybe it didn't have to be proven. Maybe it didn't even have to be witnessed. Another song rose from the trees, then faded naturally without a dramatic ending. No grand finale. Just a soft return to quiet. Tyler opened his eyes. The sky was lighter now, not bright yet, but changing. He straightened up, brushed his hands together, and took a step forward on the trail. The birds continued behind him, unconcerned with whether he stayed or went. As he walked, the question that had been following him didn't disappear completely, but it felt less heavy, less demanding, like it didn't need an answer right now. He didn't need to sing louder. He didn't need to wait for approval. He just needed to keep moving through his own morning at his own pace, and somehow that felt like enough for now. Tyler kept walking as the light slowly spread between the trees. The trail curved gently ahead, familiar, but never boring. He'd walked it hundreds of times in different weather, different moods, different versions of himself. It always looked slightly new anyway. The birds were still singing, though, not all at once anymore. One would call out then, another leaving small pockets of quiet in between. The pauses felt just as important as the sound itself. Nothing rushed to fill them. Tyler noticed how his steps had fallen into an easy rhythm. Not forced, not measured, just moving. His shoulders dropped a little more with each breath, as if his body was remembering something it had forgotten during the week. He thought about how often he'd treated his own life like a performance, even when no one was watching. How he'd edited himself internally, adjusting tone and pace, wondering how things looked from the outside. It was exhausting, living as if there were always an audience somewhere beyond the trees. The birds didn't live that way. They didn't ask if the forest approved of their song. They didn't replay it later, wondering if they could have done it better. They didn't compare themselves to the bird 3 branches over. They sang. And when they were done, they stopped. Tyler slowed and sat on a fallen log near the edge of the trail. The wood was cool and slightly damp solid beneath him. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his gaze soften, not focused on anything in particular. The forest continued its quiet work around him. There was something healing about realizing that his worth didn't have to be constantly reaffirmed, that he didn't need to earn the right to exist comfortably in his own life. He could just be here, breathing, listening, taking up space without apology. He hadn't always believed that. Growing up, praise had come with conditions. Do well, be useful, make sense to other people. Over time, he'd learned to translate attention into value silence, into doubt. If no one was responding, maybe he wasn't doing enough. Maybe he needed to try harder. But the forest offered no feedback like that. It didn't reward or withhold. It simply allowed everything to exist in its own way. Tall trees, small birds, quiet mornings, all of it counted. Tyler felt a small smile touch his face again. Not because he'd figured something out, but because he didn't feel the need to figure anything out anymore. The pressure to define himself softened the way fog lifts without being pushed. A bird landed on a nearby branch close enough for Tyler to hear the flutter of wings. It stayed for a moment, then lifted off again. No drama, no attachment, just motion. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds layer over one another, the birds, the wind, his own breathing. Each sound arrived, stayed, and moved on. None of them asked to be held. When he opened his eyes, the morning felt fully present now. Light had reached the forest floor. Colors had returned. Tyler stood brushing dirt from his hands and continued down the trail. As he walked, a thought surfaced, simple and unforced. Maybe I don't need to be seen to be real. It wasn't a declaration, just a quiet noticing. The birds kept singing behind him, not concerned with whether he remembered them later. They weren't building a case for their importance. They were living it moment by moment, without explanation. Tyler reached the point where the trail split. He paused, then chose the left path, the one that dipped slightly before rising again. He didn't analyze the choice. It just felt right. The forest held him as he moved forward. No spotlight, no applause, no judgment. Just the steady presence of something larger where every small voice had its place. By the time the trail opened up near the ranger station, the birds had quieted. The morning had moved on. Tyler felt ready to move with it. He didn't feel suddenly confident or transformed. He didn't feel certain about everything ahead. But he felt settled, like something inside him had found its natural pitch again. Not too loud, not too small, just true to itself. And that he realized was enough. May's hands were already dusted with flour before the rest of the city fully woke up. The bakery lights were on, soft and yellow, cutting through the early dark. The room smelled warm even before anything went into the oven. Yeast, sugar, something alive in the air. May stood at the stainless steel counter, folding dough over itself again and again, pressing, turning, feeling the texture change under her palms. She'd done this thousands of times. The motion didn't require thought anymore. Her hands knew when the dough needed more pressure, when it needed to rest. The rhythm was steady, almost quieting. Still, her mind drifted the way it often did in the early hours when the world felt bigger than her small corner of it. Some days she felt invisible, not in a dramatic way, just small. One bakery on one street, one woman waking up before dawn to make bread most people would eat without thinking. Customers came and went. Compliments were polite. Life moved on. Occasionally, when she scrolled her phone during breaks, she saw stories of expansion. Bigger shops, louder success, people announcing milestones with confidence and certainty. And a familiar thought would slip in uninvited. What difference does one small life really make? May folded the dough again. The surface smoothed slightly under her hands. She sprinkled a little flour on the counter, watching the fine grains scatter and settle. Each one caught the light for just a second before becoming indistinguishable from the rest. She remembered a line she'd once read years ago. Something about seeing the universe in a grain of sand. At the time, it had sounded poetic, but distant, like a nice idea meant for someone else's life. Standing there now, she wondered what it had really meant. The dough resisted her slightly, then yielded. She paused, resting her palms flat, feeling the warmth begin to build beneath the surface. The transformation was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Nothing dramatic happened, just slow change guided by time and care. May moved the dough aside and reached for another bowl. As she poured ingredients together, the sound was soft and dry, flour against metal, quiet, unimpressive. And yet, this was how mornings began for her. Not with headlines or announcements, but with these small, repetitive acts that quietly fed people she would never fully know. She thought about how often she judged herself by scale, by how big something looked from the outside, by how many people noticed, by whether her efforts echoed beyond her immediate reach. It was easy to feel insignificant when measured that way. But the bakery didn't operate on scale. It operated on attention. If she rushed, the bread suffered. If she was careless, the texture changed. Each small choice mattered, even if no one ever traced it back to her hands. May leaned against the counter for a moment, stretching her fingers. Her joints ached slightly. A familiar, honest ache. Proof of effort, even if the effort didn't come with applause. She looked at the flour still clinging to her skin, tiny white marks against warm brown. Each grain was almost nothing on its own, easy to wipe away, easy to overlook. But together they made the dough what it was. Without them, there was no bread. The thought landed gently, not as a lesson, but as a quiet recognition. She didn't need to be vast to be essential. She didn't need to be seen by everyone to be part of something whole. May returned to her work slower now, more present. She noticed the way the dough responded to her touch, the way patience made a difference. Outside, the city began to stir. A car passed. Somewhere nearby, a door opened and closed. Inside the bakery, time felt thicker, denser, like it was holding more than usual. She shaped the dough into loaves and placed them carefully on trays. Each one slightly different, each one complete in its own way. She slid the trays onto the rack and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. For a moment, she stood still. She thought about how the world often taught people to look outward for proof of worth, to count impact in visible results, to believe that if something didn't scale, it didn't matter. But here she was in a quiet kitchen before dawn, surrounded by small things that would soon become nourishment. Not symbolic nourishment, real nourishment. Warm bread passed from hand to hand. The oven hummed softly as it heated. May rested her palm against the metal door, feeling the warmth through her skin. She closed her eyes for just a second. If the universe could exist inside something this small, she didn't need to be afraid of her size. She just needed to keep showing up. The oven clicked softly as it reached temperature, a small sound that meant things were moving forward. May didn't rush to load the trays. She let the dough rest a little longer, trusting the pause. In baking, waiting was part of the work. Not a delay, not a mistake. Just time doing what time does best. She washed her hands at the sink, watching the flour disappear down the drain. The water ran warm, steady. As she dried her hands, she noticed how quiet the bakery still was. No customers yet, no chatter, just the low hum of machines and the faint rhythm of her own breathing. There was a strange comfort in being alone with something simple. May leaned against the counter again, eyes moving slowly around the room. The shelves, the bowls stacked neatly, the apron hanging by the door. None of it was remarkable. None of it was meant to be. And yet it all belonged together, forming a small, complete world that made sense on its own terms. She thought again about scale, about how easily the mind learned to dismiss what was small, how often more was mistaken for better, bigger reach, bigger impact, bigger proof. It was a loud way of measuring a life, and not always a gentle one. The bakery didn't ask her to be loud. It asked her to be attentive. May opened the oven door. Warm air spilled into the room, wrapping around her face and arms. She slid the trays inside one by one, careful not to jostle them. The loaves sat quietly unassuming, as if unaware of what they were about to become. She closed the door and set the timer. The waiting began again. May poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small table near the back. She didn't scroll her phone. She didn't fill the silence. She just sat there, letting the warmth of the cup seep into her hands. A thought passed through her mind, not sharp enough to interrupt the calm, but clear enough to notice maybe being small wasn't the same as being insignificant. Maybe small was simply a different way of being whole. She watched steam rise from the tea curl and disappear. Nothing about it tried to last longer than it needed to. Nothing about it tried to be more than it was. The timer rang softly. May stood, moved back to the oven, and opened the door. The smell of bread filled the bakery, rich and grounding. She pulled the trays out and set them on the cooling rack. The loaves were golden now, firm on the outside, still settling inside. They made quiet cracking sounds as they cooled, releasing heat. May smiled. Each loaf held countless grains of flour. Each grain had disappeared into something larger without losing its role. Not erased, not wasted, just included. She thought about how people often feared being swallowed by the whole, afraid of disappearing, afraid of not standing out. But maybe there was another way to belong, one that didn't require shrinking or shouting. The bread didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to explain its worth. It would be broken, shared, eaten. It would do exactly what it was meant to do. May cleaned the counter slowly, methodically. The motions felt easier, now less burdened by comparison. She wasn't suddenly free of doubt. She knew it would return as doubts tend to do. But it didn't feel like the final word anymore. Outside, the street began to wake up. Footsteps passed. A car door closed. Someone laughed briefly, then moved on. The world was expanding into its day. May placed the loaves in the display case and adjusted the labels. She stepped back and looked at them, not with pride exactly, but with quiet acknowledgement. This mattered. Not because it was large, but because it was real. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood still for a moment longer. The universe didn't require her to be vast. It didn't require her to be everywhere. It only asked her to be here. And in that small, warm bakery, surrounded by ordinary things, she felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not accomplishment, just a sense of belonging that didn't depend on size, like a grain of sand, holding more than it seemed. The box was heavier than Jason expected. It scraped softly against the wood floor as he pulled it out from under the bed, inch by inch, like it had been hiding down there on purpose. A thin layer of dust coated the top. He ran his finger across it and left a clean line through the gray. Jason sat back on his heels and stared at the box for a moment, as if waiting for it to explain itself. He hadn't planned to do this tonight. He'd only meant to straighten up his room, fold a couple shirts, stack some papers, clear the chair that had become a second closet. It was late and he'd been feeling restless in that familiar way. The way you feel when you've spent too much time in your own head and not enough time in your own life. He was home for a few days between semesters, staying in his childhood bedroom. The room looked almost the same as it always had, just slightly emptier now. Fewer posters, less clutter, a different kind of silence. In the living room, the TV had been on. Earlier, some show his mom liked to watch while she folded laundry. Now the house had settled. The air conditioner clicked on and off. The hallway light cast a soft line under his door. Jason lifted the lid of the box. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. An old baseball glove flattened and dry, a stack of birthday cards with childish handwriting, a small notebook with a cracked spiral, a cheap plastic keychain shaped like a dinosaur. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. The plastic was scratched, the colors faded. For a moment he felt something in his chest, small and sudden, like a door opening briefly into a room he'd forgotten existed. He set the keychain down and pulled out the notebook. It was full of drawings, superheroes, made-up creatures, messy maps of imaginary worlds. He flipped through the pages slowly, not laughing, not cringing, just watching. The kid who made these drawings hadn't been worried about being impressive. He'd been worried about whether the next page had enough space. Jason closed the notebook and leaned back against the bed frame. He'd been telling himself lately that he needed to get his life together, that he needed to move faster, aim higher, figure it out sooner. He'd been scrolling through other people's lives like they were instruction manuals, comparing timelines, comparing accomplishments, comparing confidence. And every time he tried to catch up to that imagined standard, something in him felt more tired, not more alive. Tonight, the box under the bed wasn't offering him a plan. It was offering him a memory of being okay without one. He reached in again and found a small trophy, the kind kids get just for participating. It wasn't shiny anymore. The gold paint had dulled. The plastic base was chipped. The little figure on top looked almost comical. Jason smiled despite himself. He remembered holding it with both hands, walking out of the gym like he'd won something huge. He remembered his dad clapping his mom, taking a picture. The trophy hadn't been proof that he was the best. It had been proof that he'd shown up. And somehow back then, that had been enough. Jason set the trophy on the floor beside him. He looked around the room, the familiar dresser, the old desk with a few new scratches, the closet door that didn't close all the way unless you lifted it slightly. Everything looked ordinary. Nothing about it screamed treasure. And yet, sitting here surrounded by these small pieces of his own history, he felt a warmth he hadn't felt in a while. Not excitement, not motivation, just a quiet sense of being held by something simple. He realized how often he'd been searching for happiness like it was somewhere else, somewhere farther, somewhere bigger. Somewhere that would finally make him feel certain, like happiness was a destination and his current life was just the waiting room. But the kid who had lived in this room hadn't been waiting for his life to begin. He'd been living it. Jason picked up one more item from the box, a folded piece of paper creased many times. He opened it carefully. It was a list written in pencil titled, "Things I Like." Underneath were simple entries: pizza, drawing, rain, being home when it's dark outside, mom's hot chocolate, when dad tells jokes. Jason read the list twice. The words weren't deep. They weren't wise. They weren't trying to sound like anything. They were honest. He felt his throat tighten slightly, not with sadness exactly, but with recognition. There had been a time when joy didn't require permission, when liking something didn't have to be justified, when being alive in a small moment was enough. Jason folded the paper back up and held it in his hand for a long second. Outside his room, the house stayed quiet. The air conditioner hummed. Somewhere, the refrigerator made a soft clicking sound. He slid the box a little closer, as if wanting it nearby. Not because he needed to go backward, but because he needed to remember what he'd been running past. Jason didn't rush to put anything back. He sat there on the floor a while longer, the box open beside him, the small pile of objects spread out like a quiet map of where he'd been. None of it felt heavy now. None of it asked him to go back or become someone he no longer was. It just existed calmly, without expectation. He leaned his back against the bed and let his legs stretch out in front of him. The carpet felt familiar under his palms, worn thinner in the spots where he'd once sat to do homework or build something out of nothing. The room held his weight easily, like it remembered how. Jason thought about how often he'd been chasing a feeling of arrival. The idea that one day he'd wake up and everything would click. That he'd feel confident, complete, certain. That happiness would finally feel stable, earned, permanent. It was a tempting story, a motivating one. But sitting here now, it felt slightly off, like a direction sign that kept pointing farther away from where he already was. The box hadn't given him answers. It hadn't offered a future. It had simply reminded him that contentment had once lived in ordinary things. And maybe it still did. Jason gathered the items slowly, not in a hurry. He stacked the notebook, the cards, the small trophy, the keychain. Each thing returned to the box without ceremony. When he reached the folded list, he paused again. Being home when it's dark outside. He looked around the room, lit only by the lamp on his desk. The rest of the house was quiet, safe. Nothing demanded his attention. For the first time in days, his mind wasn't racing ahead to the next requirement. He was home. It was dark outside. And somehow, that was enough. Jason placed the paper back into the box and closed the lid. He didn't slide it all the way under the bed this time. He left it halfway out like a reminder that it was there if he ever needed it again. He stood, stretched his arms overhead, and felt his back release slightly. The familiar stiffness eased. His body, like the room, seemed relieved to stop being measured against anything else. Jason changed into an old t-shirt and lay down on the bed. The mattress felt softer than he remembered. Or maybe he was just more willing to let himself sink into it. He stared up at the ceiling for a moment, watching the faint shadows shift as a car passed outside. His thoughts drifted not in a searching way, but in a slow, wandering one. He thought about how often people missed their own lives while trying to upgrade them. How easy it was to overlook what was already holding you quietly every day. The treasure under the bed hadn't been about the past. It had been about presence. Jason rolled onto his side, tucking the blanket around himself. The house made its usual nighttime sounds. Pipes settling. A floorboard shifting somewhere. Familiar noises that didn't need interpretation. He felt his breathing slow. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders softened into the mattress. If happiness was a place, it didn't seem far away anymore. It seemed close, almost obvious, like something that had been there the whole time, waiting patiently while he looked elsewhere. Jason didn't label the feeling. He didn't try to hold on to it. He let it be what it was, quiet, gentle, complete enough. The box stayed where it was, half hidden, half seen. The room stayed ordinary, and Jason rested inside it, not searching, not striving, just here. And for tonight, that was all that was needed. The parking lot was still dark when Marcus turned the key. The engine came to life with a low, familiar sound, steady and unremarkable. He didn't pull out right away. He let the car sit there, headlights off, dashboard glowing softly in front of him. It was that hour before morning, fully decided to arrive, the sky not quite black, not quite blue. Marcus rested his forearms on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield. The road ahead was empty. No traffic, no rush. Just pavement stretching forward, waiting. He'd been awake for a while. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because his body had learned this schedule too well. Years of early shifts had trained him to rise before the world did, to move before anyone asked. He liked that about himself. He liked being reliable. He liked being the one who showed up. But lately, something about that had started to feel heavy. Marcus was 41 now. A UPS driver. Strong hands, strong back. The kind of person people counted on without thinking much about it. When something needed to be carried, he carried it. When something needed to be done, he did it. And somewhere along the way, he'd begun to wait. Not consciously, not dramatically, just quietly. He waited for someone to notice, for someone to say, "You're doing enough," for someone to turn on a light and tell him he was headed in the right direction. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. He didn't check the time. He knew it by feel. Marcus reached to the side and picked up his thermos, taking a slow sip of coffee. It was still hot, bitter, grounding. He set it back in the cup holder and exhaled. Across the lot, one streetlight flickered, then steadied. The light didn't reach far, just enough to illuminate a small patch of asphalt beneath it. Everything else stayed in shadow. Marcus watched it for a moment longer than necessary. It reminded him of something his grandfather used to say when Marcus was a kid, whenever he complained about not knowing what to do next. "Don't wait for the sun," his grandfather would say. "Light your own lamp, just enough to see the next step." Back then, Marcus hadn't understood what that meant. He'd thought it was about confidence or bravery or being loud about what you wanted. Now, sitting alone in his truck before dawn, it felt different. Maybe it wasn't about becoming brighter. Maybe it was about becoming steadier. Marcus rested back against the seat. The fabric was worn, molded to his shape over years of use. This truck had seen a lot of his days: early mornings, long routes, quiet lunches eaten alone. It had never asked him to explain himself. He thought about how often he'd measured his worth by how much he could carry, how much responsibility he could shoulder without complaining, how little light he needed from others to keep going. But lately, the waiting had crept in. Waiting for validation, waiting for reassurance, waiting for some external signal that all this effort meant something. The streetlight flickered again, then held. Marcus realized that it didn't illuminate the whole lot. It didn't need to. It only lit what was directly beneath it. Enough to stand, enough to move. He turned the headlights on. The road ahead brightened instantly, the beam cutting through the dimness. Not the whole road, just the part right in front of him. Enough to drive, enough to trust. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. He didn't need the whole path lit up. He didn't need guarantees. He didn't need permission. He just needed enough light for the next mile. Marcus put the truck in gear and eased forward, tires rolling softly over the asphalt. As he drove toward the exit, the sky ahead lightened almost imperceptibly. Morning would come whether he waited or not, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for it. The road stayed quiet as Marcus drove, the tires humming steadily beneath him. Streetlights passed one by one, each illuminating a small circle of pavement before falling behind. None of them tried to light the whole way. They did their part, then let go. Marcus kept his hands loose on the wheel. His shoulders, usually braced for a long day ahead, had softened. The familiar route unfolded in front of him, turns he knew by heart, intersections he could navigate without thinking. The truck moved forward easily, as if it too understood that there was no need to rush. He thought about how long he'd been waiting for something to change. Not the job, not the schedule, but the feeling that his life would somehow feel more complete once someone else acknowledged it. Like the weight he carried would feel lighter once it was seen. But driving like this in the early quiet, he noticed something different. The light he needed was already there. It didn't come as praise or recognition. It came as the steady glow of knowing what to do next. Turn here, slow down there, keep moving. Marcus remembered all the small choices he made each day that no one applauded. Getting up early, finishing routes, helping a neighbor load a box, calling his sister back even when he was tired. None of it felt heroic. None of it needed to. It was enough to be consistent. The sky continued to brighten just slightly, not enough to erase the darkness completely. Marcus didn't watch it closely. He let it happen in the background. He didn't need to track progress to trust that it was happening. He took another sip of coffee. It had cooled a bit, but the taste was still familiar, comforting. He smiled faintly, thinking about how many mornings had started exactly like this. How many he'd rushed through half-present waiting for something else to arrive. This morning felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he wasn't asking it to. Marcus reached a long stretch of road with no lights at all. Just darkness beyond the headlights. The beam ahead held steady, revealing the lane lines and the edges of the road. Enough to keep going. He thought about his grandfather again, about the way he'd spoken without drama, as if what he was saying didn't need to be impressive to be true. Light your own lamp. It didn't mean doing everything alone. It didn't mean shutting people out. It meant not giving away the responsibility of your own sense of direction. It meant trusting that your inner sense of enough didn't have to be approved by anyone else. Marcus felt his breathing deepen naturally, matching the rhythm of the drive. In, out. The road flowed under him mile by mile. He wasn't thinking about the rest of the day anymore. He wasn't rehearsing conversations or counting stops. He was just here in motion, guided by a light that moved with him. The truck turned into another lot, then another street. The world was waking slowly now. A few cars appeared. A storefront sign flickered on. Ordinary life beginning again. Marcus parked briefly, shut off the engine, and sat in the quiet that followed. The sudden stillness felt complete, not empty. He rested his hands in his lap and closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't feel the need to ask whether this was enough. It was. The light had done its job. The path had revealed itself step by step. And Marcus, steady and unremarkable in the best way, continued on. The oil lamp didn't burn brighter than necessary. It simply stayed lit, and that was all it ever needed to do. The locker room smelled like metal and soap. Noah sat on the bench with his boots unlaced, elbows resting on his knees, helmet placed carefully on the floor in front of him. The room was mostly empty now. A few lockers stood open, their doors swinging slightly before settling back into stillness. Somewhere down the hall, a shower ran water hitting tile in a steady rhythm. Noah rubbed a towel across the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. It hadn't been a bad call. No one was hurt. No fire had spread. Everything had gone the way it was supposed to. And yet his body felt worn in that familiar way, like something inside him had been scraped a little thinner. He picked up his helmet and turned it in his hands. The surface was scuffed, dulled from years of use. A few scratches caught the light. None of them new, none of them dramatic. Just the quiet evidence of repetition. People often talked about his job like it was all adrenaline and heroics. But most days, it wasn't like that. Most days were about patience, about waiting, about being ready for something that might not happen. And when it did happen, about staying steady under pressure. That steadiness came at a cost. Noah slid the helmet back into his locker and closed the door. The metal clanged softly final. He leaned back against the bench and stared at the floor, letting his breathing slow. Lately, he'd been feeling the weight of it more than usual. Not fear, not doubt about his ability, something quieter. The sense that each challenge left a mark even when things went well. That each test, each difficult moment was sanding something down inside him. He wondered sometimes if all this friction was slowly wearing him away. An older firefighter had once said something to him during a long night shift years ago. They'd been sitting on the back step of the station drinking burnt coffee, watching the sky lighten just enough to signal morning. "You know what they do with jade?" the man had said out of nowhere. "They don't cut it clean. They grind it. Over and over. Takes forever." Noah hadn't known what to say at the time. He'd nodded, half listening, half exhausted. Now the memory surfaced again, unexpectedly clear. Jade didn't start out smooth. It wasn't impressive at first glance. It was dense, rough, hard to shape. And the only way it became something people valued was through repeated polishing, through friction. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily over time. Noah flexed his hands, noticing the faint soreness in his fingers. These hands had learned how to hold steady when things shook, how to grip, release, adjust. They bore small scars he rarely thought about anymore. He'd always assumed that being tested meant something was wrong. That struggle was a sign of weakness. That if things were truly aligned, they would feel easier. But the jade didn't become dull because it was polished. It became clear. Noah stood and stretched his arms overhead, feeling the tightness along his shoulders release a little. The room seemed quieter now, the earlier energy fully drained away. He thought about the moments that had shaped him the most. They weren't the ones where everything went perfectly. They were the moments that had demanded something from him. Patience, restraint, courage, humility. Moments that had forced him to slow down and stay present. Each one had felt uncomfortable at the time. Each one had left him changed. He picked up his jacket and slipped it on the familiar weight settling around him. It felt grounding, like a reminder of who he was when things got hard. The locker room lights flickered briefly, then steadied. Noah turned toward the door, pausing for a second before leaving. Maybe he wasn't being worn down. Maybe he was being refined. The thought didn't erase the fatigue. It didn't make the work lighter, but it gave the weight a different shape, one he could carry without resentment. Noah reached for the door handle and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The night beyond waited calmly, indifferent to what he'd just been through. And for the first time that evening, he felt less like something was being taken from him, and more like something was being revealed. The hallway outside the locker room felt cooler, quieter. Noah's footsteps echoed softly as he walked toward the exit, the sound fading almost as soon as it appeared. The building had settled for the night. Whatever urgency had filled it earlier was gone now, replaced by a steady calm that didn't need explanation. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of asphalt and damp grass. A few stars were visible above the station, dim but present. Noah paused, hands in his jacket pockets, and let the night meet him where he was. His body still felt tired. That hadn't changed, but the tiredness no longer felt like something he needed to fight. It felt earned, honest, like a signal that he had stayed present when it mattered. He thought again about the jade, about how polishing wasn't about force. It was about consistency. Pressure applied slowly, carefully, with attention. Too much and the stone cracked. Too little and nothing changed. The process demanded patience more than strength. That felt familiar. Noah had learned over the years how to stay with difficult moments without rushing past them. How to respond instead of react. How to trust his training when instinct wanted to take over. None of that showed up as brilliance from the outside. It showed up as quiet reliability. And that reliability had been shaped, not gifted. He walked toward his car and unlocked it, the sound of the door opening small and final in the quiet lot. Before getting in, he leaned against the side of the vehicle, feeling the cool metal through his jacket. He remembered times when he'd wished things were easier. When he'd wondered why certain challenges kept returning slightly different, but familiar enough to recognize. He'd thought he was failing to move past something. Now the pattern looked different. The repetition wasn't punishment. It was practice. Each time he stayed steady, something inside him smoothed out just a little more. Each time he chose patience over force, clarity over impulse. He became more himself, not less. Noah sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. The interior light clicked on briefly, then went dark. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and took a slow breath in, then out. The mind liked to tell stories about struggle, that it meant damage, that it meant loss. But the body often knew better. The body understood adaptation. It understood how friction could strengthen instead of weaken. He started the car and let it idle, not in a hurry to leave. The engine's low vibration traveled up through the seat, grounding him. Noah didn't feel proud. He didn't feel accomplished. What he felt was something quieter and more stable, a sense of trust. Trust that what he was going through was shaping him in ways he couldn't fully see yet. The jade didn't shine while it was being polished. It didn't announce its progress. It simply endured the process slowly, becoming clear. Noah pulled out of the lot and onto the road. The station disappeared behind him, lights dimming in the rearview mirror. The route home was familiar. He didn't need directions. As he drove, the tension in his shoulders eased. His thoughts loosened their grip. The day began to recede, leaving behind only what was necessary. He wasn't broken. He wasn't behind. He was becoming. The road stretched ahead, dark and open. Noah followed it, calmly illuminated, just enough to keep moving. Whatever came next would bring its own friction. He knew that, but now it felt less like something to fear and more like part of the shaping. The jade would continue to be polished, and in its own time, it would shine. There was an extra chair pulled up to the kitchen island, and no one was sitting in it. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Earlier, the space was tight, crowded with bags, mail, a half-empty water bottle, a laptop pushed to one side. Everything had a place, and that place was usually right where the hands could reach it. Nothing was meant to rest. Everything was meant to be ready. Now, it was late. The overhead light was off, leaving only the small yellow lamp above the sink. The dishwasher hummed in its steady, forgettable way, like a sound the house made when it was allowed to take care of itself. Outside, a car passed once, then the street went quiet again. The chair was plain, wooden, nothing special. It had been pulled over almost without thinking, just slid across the floor until it faced the island. The person standing there didn't sit down right away. They leaned against the counter instead, arms crossed, shoulders lifted a little higher than necessary. All day, there had been things to hold. A meeting that needed preparation, a message that couldn't be ignored, a problem that wasn't technically theirs, but somehow still ended up in their hands. Even dinner had been eaten quickly, standing up fork, resting on the edge of the sink between bites. There was always a sense that if they stopped moving, something might fall apart. The body remembered that feeling now, even though the day was technically over. The shoulders stayed tight. The jaw didn't quite unclench. The mind kept scanning like it was still on duty, waiting for the next thing that might need attention. The empty chair didn't ask for anything. It just stayed where it was. For a moment, the person noticed an odd irritation rise up. The chair felt unnecessary, in the way, like a pause that hadn't been earned yet. There was still tomorrow to think about, still loose ends, still that quiet pressure to be useful, to prove something even to an empty room. They reached for a mug and filled it with water, then set it down on the island without drinking. The dishwasher hummed. A soft click came from somewhere inside it, a small mechanical decision being made without any help. There was a memory, faint but persistent, of being younger and being told to wait, to stand back, to make room. Someone else needed the seat more. Someone else mattered more in that moment. It wasn't said cruelly. It didn't have to be. It was just the way things were arranged. Over time, standing became normal, hovering, being ready, being available. The chair scraped softly as it was pulled back a few inches. The sound was louder than expected in the quiet kitchen. The person paused, hands still on the top rail, as if surprised by their own movement. They sat down slowly. At first it felt wrong, too exposed, like sitting meant admitting something they weren't sure they were allowed to admit yet. The back of the chair pressed gently between the shoulder blades. The feet found the floor. The body registered contact, weight support. Nothing dramatic happened. The room didn't change. The to-do list didn't disappear. Tomorrow didn't cancel itself. But something inside the chest loosened just enough to be noticeable. It's strange how unfamiliar rest can feel when you haven't practiced it in a while. Not the kind of rest that comes from collapsing at the end of the day, but the kind that comes from choosing to stop before you're forced to. The kind that says, just for now, this is enough. The person noticed how the island looked from this angle, how the edge was worn smooth in one spot, how a small crumb had been missed during cleaning. Ordinary details suddenly visible when the body wasn't leaning forward anymore. They rested their hands on their thighs. The fingers twitched once, like they were checking whether they were allowed to be empty. The mind tried out of habit to fill the space. You should answer that email. You forgot to follow up. You could be doing more right now. The thoughts arrived the way they always did, lined up and confident, like they belonged there. But tonight they didn't land quite as hard. It was as if the chair absorbed some of the impact. as if having a place to sit gave the body permission not to obey every instruction immediately. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never letting yourself arrive anywhere. From always being slightly ahead of the moment you're in, reaching for the next thing before this one is even settled. The person noticed their breathing, not in a deliberate way, just noticed that it had slowed. The inhale wasn't rushed. The exhale went a little longer than expected, like the body was surprised it had the time. The empty chair across from them stayed empty. It didn't accuse, it didn't compare. It didn't ask them to earn the right to be there. It simply marked a space where effort wasn't required. For the first time that evening, the person let their shoulders drop fully. Not all at once, just a fraction, enough to feel the difference. Enough to realize how high they'd been holding them all day without noticing. They stayed there longer than they meant to. Not because they were trying to heal anything. Not because they were making a point. Just because for once, nothing was pulling them away. And somewhere in that quiet kitchen with the dishwasher humming and the extra chair holding its place, a small truth settled in. Without words, a maybe rest isn't something you get after everything is done. Maybe it's something you're allowed to take, even when the world keeps going. They didn't stay seated the whole time. After a while, they stood up again, almost out of habit. Rinsed the mug in the sink, wiped a small spill on the counter. The body still knew its routines, still wanted to be useful, still wanted to justify its presence by doing something that looked productive. But when they were done, they didn't rush away. They pulled the chair back again. This time the movement felt less strange, less like stealing time, more like returning to a place that had been there all along. Sitting down didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt normal, which surprised them. The dishwasher clicked and shifted into a new cycle. A deeper, slower hum filled the kitchen, like the house had decided to settle for the night. The lamp over the sink cast a soft shadow on the wall, uneven and imperfect. Nothing in the room looked curated or impressive. It just looked lived in. From this stillness, another thought surfaced. Not sharp, not demanding, just quiet and persistent. What if I don't have to earn my place here? The idea felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. Somewhere along the way, rest had become something that had to be justified. You rest after you finish. You sit once you've proven your value. You stop only when there's nothing left that could possibly need you. But there was always something left. The person thought about how often they'd made space for others without hesitation. Pulled out chairs, adjusted schedules, listened longer than they had energy for, said yes even when their body was already tired. It wasn't resentment they felt now, just a soft recognition of a pattern that had been running quietly for years. They had learned to be the one who stands by, stands in, stands ready. And over time, standing became part of how they measured their worth. If they were needed, they mattered. If they were useful, they belonged. Sitting down felt like disappearing. The empty chair across from them broke that spell a little. It was still there, still unoccupied, still unnecessary in the most ordinary way. And yet it held something important, the idea that space doesn't have to be taken from someone else to exist, that making room for yourself doesn't mean pushing anyone out. The person rested their elbows lightly on the island. The cool surface grounded them. They noticed how the day had finally reached their hands and feet. How tiredness, when allowed to arrive, felt different from exhaustion. Softer, more honest. There's a difference between being worn down and being allowed to stop. They had mistaken one for the other for a long time. The mind tried again to fill the quiet. You could be better than this. You should be further along. Other people don't need this much rest. The thoughts came, but now they were quieter, less convincing, like echoes in a room that had already emptied. The person didn't argue with them, didn't correct them, didn't try to replace them with something more positive. They just let the thoughts pass through the way sound passes through a space, without leaving marks on the walls. They stayed seated. The chair held their weight without comment. In that simple support, something shifted. Not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to change the tone of the evening. The pressure to be impressive softened. The need to justify their existence loosened its grip. They didn't suddenly feel confident or healed or whole in some dramatic sense. They just felt present. And present, it turned out, was enough for the night. The value they had been chasing all day wasn't missing. It hadn't been delayed or denied. It had just been quiet, waiting for them to stop running long enough to notice it. Value didn't come from what they completed, or how much they carried, or how little space they took up. It was already there in the body, sitting in the chair, in the breath moving without effort, in the simple fact of being here, even when nothing was being produced. They looked once more at the empty chair across from them and understood it differently now. It wasn't empty because no one deserved it. It was empty because there was finally room. Room to sit without proving anything. Room to rest without explanation. Room to exist without performing. Eventually, they would stand again. Turn off the lamp. Walk down the hallway. Tomorrow would come as it always did, with its lists and demands and small urgencies. But something would go with them. The memory of that chair. The feel of being supported without conditions. The quiet knowing that their worth hadn't changed based on how much they did. And even when the chair was pushed back under the table, even when the kitchen returned to its usual arrangement, that space would still exist. Not in the room, but inside them. A place they could return to. A place that didn't need to be earned. The parking lot was almost empty. Just a few cars scattered across the far rows, their windshields catching the last light of the day. The grocery store sign hummed faintly behind them, steady and indifferent. Somewhere near the entrance, a cart rattled as someone pushed it back into place, the sound echoing longer than it should have. They sat in their car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, not quite ready to go anywhere. Earlier, the day had fallen apart in a quiet way. No shouting, no dramatic ending, just a short conversation that didn't go the way they'd hoped. A polite tone, a careful explanation. Words like, unfortunately and at this time. The kind of ending that leaves no clear edge to push against, no one to blame. Not even yourself yet, somehow still leaves a heaviness behind. Failure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in gently dressed as a reasonable outcome. They'd nodded, thanked the person on the other end, closed the laptop, done all the right things. And still the feeling followed them out the door, into the car, into the long pause before turning the key. Now the sky was changing. A thick layer of clouds hung low, dull and gray, like they'd been there all day. But near the horizon, something else was happening. A thin band of light pushed through soft and warm, coloring the edges of the clouds in pale gold. The sun hadn't disappeared. It had just been hidden. They noticed how quickly their mind had jumped to conclusions earlier. This means I'm not good enough. This proves I waited too long. This sets me back more than I can afford. The thoughts came fast, stacking on top of one another, each one sounding certain, final. As if one moment could define the shape of an entire life. They leaned forward and wiped a small smudge from the inside of the windshield with their sleeve. The glass cleared just enough to sharpen the view. The light grew brighter for a second, then shifted again as the clouds moved. It occurred to them that the sun didn't argue with the clouds. It didn't rush them, didn't burn through them, didn't take their presence personally. It simply stayed where it was, doing what it always did. There had been other days like this before. Other moments that felt like proof of something going wrong. And yet, looking back, those moments hadn't erased who they were. They hadn't taken away their ability to learn to try again, to show up differently next time. But in the middle of it, it never felt that way. In the middle of it, the clouds felt permanent. They remembered being younger, equating success with visibility. If something was seen, it mattered. If it wasn't acknowledged, it didn't count. Praise felt like sunlight. Silence felt like disappearance. Over time, that belief hardened. They learned to track their worth through outcomes, through approvals, through signs that others could see and name. So when something didn't work out, it didn't just feel disappointing. It felt like dimming. They sat back in the seat, feeling the cool fabric against their shoulders. The car next to them pulled out slowly, tires crunching against loose gravel. For a moment, the lot was quiet again. The sky kept changing. The clouds drifted, reshaping themselves without effort. Light slid along their edges, sometimes bright, sometimes barely there. The scene refused to settle into a single interpretation. They took a breath, not deep, not intentional. Just the kind that happens when the body realizes it's safe to pause. What if this moment isn't saying anything about my value? The thought surprised them. Not because it felt obviously true, but because it felt possible. They had been treating the outcome like a verdict, a final word. But maybe it was closer to weather. Something that passed through, something that changed conditions without changing the sky itself. They thought about how often they'd admired resilience in others, how they'd watched people move through setbacks and still remain themselves. Still kind, still capable, still worthy of respect even when things didn't go their way. Somehow, it had never occurred to them that the same might apply inward. The light near the horizon deepened, turning amber, then soft orange. For a brief moment, the clouds looked almost translucent, like thin fabric held up to a lamp. They felt a familiar ache in their chest, not sharp, just heavy. A mix of disappointment and tiredness. They didn't push it away, didn't label it as weakness. They let it sit there like the clouds sat in the sky. Failure, they were realizing, doesn't erase what came before it. It doesn't cancel effort. It doesn't rewrite your entire story unless you let it. It only blocks the view for a while. They stayed in the car longer than they needed to, watching the sky dim slowly, the colors fading into blue-gray. The sun slipped fully behind the clouds, now no longer visible at all. And still, they knew it was there. They turned the key but didn't drive off right away. The dashboard lights came on softly, casting a pale glow across the inside of the car. The radio stayed off. The world outside felt quiet enough on its own. The sky had lost most of its color, now settling into a calm, even gray. The disappointment was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it no longer felt like an emergency. There's a difference between pain that needs fixing and pain that just needs space. For a long time, they had treated every uncomfortable feeling like a problem to solve. If something hurt, it must mean something was wrong with them. If they felt stuck, it must mean they had failed in some essential way. Sitting there, watching the clouds thicken, they began to sense another option. Maybe this feeling didn't need a solution. Maybe it just needed permission to pass through. They thought about how often they had confused visibility with value. How praise felt like sunlight and silence felt like being erased. How easily one unanswered email could undo weeks of steady work in their mind. It wasn't that they believed others were shallow. It was that they had learned to see themselves through the same narrow lens. Outcome equals worth. Progress equals proof. Setback equals something missing. Those rules had never been spoken out loud, but they had shaped the way they moved through the world all the same. The clouds above continued their slow drift. Some thickened, some thinned. None of them stayed exactly as they were. The sun didn't fight them. It didn't try to shine harder to compensate. It didn't dim itself in response. It simply remained. The thought landed gently. What if my value is like that? Not something that appears only when conditions are perfect. Not something that has to be proven each time it's questioned. Just something that exists steady and unchanged, whether or not it's being seen. They felt a subtle shift in their chest. Not relief exactly, more like steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with what is. They had done their part. They had shown up. They had tried. The outcome was only one small piece of a much larger movement, one moment in a longer cycle. They started the car fully this time and eased out of the parking space. As they drove, the headlights cut through the dim evening, illuminating patches of road, one at a time. They didn't need to see the whole way. just the next few feet. That felt familiar. So much of their life had unfolded like this already, step by step. Light reaching only so far ahead. Trust built not from certainty, but from motion. A red light caught them at the edge of the lot. They stopped and waited. The clouds above were darker now, but the air felt cooler, calmer. They noticed how their breath matched the rhythm of the drive. Inhale at the stop. Exhale as the car rolled forward again. The body knew how to move through this, even if the mind still had questions. There would be other attempts, other conversations, other moments where things didn't go as planned. That wasn't a sign of deficiency. It was a sign of being in motion. Failure, when seen clearly, wasn't the opposite of worth. It was simply part of the weather. And weather changes. They merged onto the road's streetlights, passing overhead in a steady pattern. Each one lit up the windshield briefly, then disappeared behind them. The repetition was comforting, predictable in a way that didn't demand attention. They didn't feel triumphant. They didn't suddenly feel confident or resolved. They just felt intact, still themselves, still capable, still worthy of being here exactly as they were. The clouds could stay as long as they needed to. The sun wasn't going anywhere. She rests her forearms on the edge of the bathtub and watches the water settle. The room is dim lit only by a small lamp near the sink. The rest of the apartment has already gone quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives after everything that needs to be done has been done, whether perfectly or not. She dips her fingers into the bath and moves them slowly, creating thin lines across the surface. The water responds immediately, rippling outward in soft circles that overlap and disappear as quickly as they form. She pauses and waits. The surface smooths itself out, returning to stillness without effort. She tries again, this time dragging her hand gently from one side of the tub to the other, as if drawing something. For a moment the shape exists, a wavering line, imperfect but visible. Then it breaks apart, dissolving into smaller movements until there's nothing left to point to. She exhales a quiet sound she hadn't planned to make. It reminds her of how her thoughts have been lately. They appear clearly, sometimes sharply, and then fade before she can decide what to do with them. Ideas about the past, questions about the future, observations that feel important for a moment, then lose their weight. She has a habit of trying to hold on to them. Not physically, of course, but mentally. She repeats them, examines them, turns them over as if clarity will come from staying longer. More often than not, all that happens is exhaustion. She trails her fingers through the water again, this time faster. The surface becomes busy, restless, layered with movement. The ripples collide, reflect, cancel each other out. The water looks unsettled now, as if it's lost its sense of direction. She pulls her hand away and watches. It takes a few seconds, but the movement fades. The surface smooths itself out, patient and unbothered by what just happened. She leans her head back against the tile and closes her eyes for a moment. The warmth of the bath seeps into her skin, loosening something in her shoulders. She thinks about how often she's done this to her mind, stirred it repeatedly, added thought after thought, convinced that more thinking would lead to clarity. Instead, it only made everything cloudy. The water doesn't hold on to what she draws in it. It doesn't remember the lines she makes. It doesn't judge whether they were good or bad. It simply returns to itself. She opens her eyes and looks again at the smooth surface. It reflects the dim light in soft broken shapes. Nothing is fixed. Nothing stays. She dips her finger in once more, just enough to disturb the surface. A small ripple forms, then fades. She resists the urge to do more. A thought arises, something about a conversation earlier in the day. Normally, she would follow it immediately, replaying it, refining it, wondering what it meant. This time she notices it like a ripple appearing briefly, then spreading outward. She doesn't chase it. The thought thins out, then disappears, leaving behind a quiet she doesn't rush to fill. Her breathing slows. The room feels larger, as if space has been added without moving any walls. She rests her hands on the cool porcelain and stays there, watching nothing happen. It occurs to her how strange that would have felt not long ago. To sit without engaging, to let thoughts come and go without intervening. She used to believe that if she didn't hold on to them, she might lose something important. Now, watching the water return to stillness again and again, she senses the opposite. Nothing important is lost. The bathwater remains warm. The room remains quiet. She remains here. The surface of the water waits open and unmarked, ready for the next movement or none at all. She stays in the bath longer than she planned to, not because she's waiting for something, but because there's nothing pushing her to leave. The water holds its warmth, steadily wrapping around her legs in a way that feels supportive rather than heavy. She lifts her hand and lets the last drops fall back into the tub. Each one lands with a soft sound barely noticeable, sending out tiny ripples that vanish almost as soon as they appear. She watches them fade. Her mind, so used to grabbing onto moments like these and turning them into reflections or lessons, hesitates. A thought starts to form, then pauses as if unsure whether it needs to complete itself. She notices the pause. There's a gentle relief in not finishing the thought and not turning it into anything solid. The quiet that follows feels clean, like a surface that hasn't been written on yet. She remembers how often she's tried to make her thoughts permanent, writing them down, repeating them, holding them close, afraid that if she didn't, they might disappear forever. As if the value of a thought depended on how long she could keep it alive. But the water tells a different story. No line she draws here is meant to last. No shape is meant to be preserved. And yet, the water is no poorer for it. If anything, it feels freer. She traces one last slow circle with her finger, watching the motion spread outward. This time she doesn't name it. She doesn't compare it to anything else. She simply observes the movement and lets it finish on its own. The surface grows still again. A thought about tomorrow drifts in. A task, a small concern. She sees it clearly, like a faint reflection on the water's surface. She lets it be there. Then, she lets it go. It slips away without resistance, leaving no trace behind. The absence doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space. She shifts slightly, leaning her head against the side of the tub, eyes half closed. The bathroom feels cocooned, separate from the rest of the world. The usual urge to review the day, to replay moments and analyze them, doesn't arrive. There's nothing to stir. She realizes how much of her overthinking has come from revisiting the same mental drawings again and again, tracing the same lines, hoping they'll finally hold their shape. Each time the result has been the same: more movement, more disturbance, less clarity. The water never asks her to stop drawing. It simply shows her what happens when she does. She reaches for the towel and drapes it over the edge of the tub, then slowly stands, feeling the air cool against her skin. Even now, droplets slide down and fall away, leaving her lighter unmarked. She wraps the towel around herself and takes one last look at the bathwater. The surface is calm, reflecting the dim light, softly holding nothing from before. She turns off the lamp and steps out of the bathroom, the quiet following her without effort. The hallway is dark, but not unsettling. Each step feels deliberate and unhurried. As she settles into bed, thoughts still appear, but they come like ripples from a distant touch, faint and brief. She doesn't reach for them. She lets them pass. The mind, given nothing to hold on to, begins to rest. Tonight, she doesn't need to remember every thought. She doesn't need to finish every mental picture. Like painting on water, her thoughts can appear shimmer for a moment and fade, leaving the surface just as it was. And that is enough. They wake up with a strange certainty that they were someone else a moment ago. Not in a dramatic way, not like a nightmare that leaves the heart racing, but in a quiet, lingering way, like a scent that stays in the air after a candle has been blown out. Their eyes open to a dark room, the faint outline of the window barely visible, and yet the feeling remains. In the dream, they were light. They don't remember every detail, but they remember the sensation of moving without effort, of drifting where they wanted to drift. There was no schedule, no pressure, no constant checking of what came next. There was only motion and air, and a simple kind of presence that didn't need explaining. They lie still under the blanket, letting the last pieces of the dream float around their mind. The more they try to grab them, the faster they slide away, like water running through open hands. Their phone sits on the nightstand, face down, silent. The apartment is quiet. Somewhere in the building, a pipe clicks softly, then stops. Their mind, as if realizing the dream is ending, reaches for something solid. It finds yesterday. It finds old worries that have been waiting lined up neatly, like items on a shelf. It finds unfinished conversations, decisions that still feel uncertain, feelings they didn't have time to process. The body is still warm from sleep, but the mind begins to tighten, preparing for the familiar weight of being awake. They stare into the darkness, feeling the shift happen in real time. It's not that the worries are new. It's that they feel so convincing when they arrive, so real, so urgent, as if the mind is reporting facts rather than creating stories. They sit up slowly and swing their feet to the floor. The carpet is cool. Their shoulders slump forward slightly as if the weight has already returned. They rub their eyes and try to remember the dream again, but it's fading quickly now. The more they chase it, the more distant it becomes, until all that's left is the faint impression of being light, and even that begins to dissolve. They stand and walk to the kitchen for a glass of water. The hallway is dim lit by a small nightlight near the baseboard. The quiet feels soft, as if the apartment is still half asleep. In the kitchen, they fill a glass and drink slowly. The water is cold and plain. It grounds them in the body, in the present moment, in something unquestionably real. And yet, as they stand there, they notice something unsettling. The worry in their head feels just as real as the water. The worry has weight, texture, shape. It pulls their attention in the same way a loud sound would. It demands the same immediate response. It insists without hesitation that it is the truth of their life. They rest one hand on the counter and breathe out through the nose, slow and steady, like they're trying to lower the volume without pressing any buttons. A thought surfaces. What if I mess something up today? It lands with a familiar heaviness. Their stomach tightens slightly, preparing to run through possibilities. Then another thought follows, even quieter. How do I know this thought is real? The question surprises them. They aren't asking it in a philosophical way, not trying to be clever. The dream is still close enough that the question feels natural. In the dream, everything felt real too. The air, the movement, the ease. And then they woke up and it vanished without leaving proof behind. They looked down at the glass in their hand. Water. Cold, real. They look at the thought again. Fear, tightness, real. They stand in the small kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant city sounds outside. And they realize they've been treating their inner world like the only reality that matters. If the mind says something is dangerous, it becomes dangerous. If the mind says something is hopeless, it becomes hopeless. If the mind says something is ruined, it becomes ruined. Even when nothing in the room has changed. They set the glass down and lean their forehead lightly against the cabinet door, eyes closed, letting the cool surface meet their skin. The contact is simple, grounding, quietly reassuring. They remember the feeling of being light again, not as a dream to chase, but as a reminder that the mind can create entire worlds, complete with emotions and certainty, and then dissolve them. They open their eyes and step back from the counter. The kitchen is still just the kitchen. The night is still the night. The air is still. The worry is still there, but it doesn't feel as solid as it did a few minutes ago. It feels more like a mood passing through, like weather, like something the mind is doing rather than something the world is demanding. They return to the bedroom and sit on the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely on their thighs. The blanket is rumpled. The room is dark but calm. They don't try to force the worry away. They simply hold it with a new kind of question. What if this too is something the mind is dreaming? They sit on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting the question rest without answering it. What if this too is something the mind is dreaming? The room doesn't react. The walls don't shift. The night doesn't pause to confirm or deny anything. Everything stays exactly as it is, steady and unbothered. They notice how the worry changes when they stop arguing with it. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't suddenly turn into peace. But it loosens just enough to feel less solid, like something that can be observed rather than obeyed. They lie back down and pull the blanket up, resting on their side, eyes open to the darkness. The ceiling is barely visible, a soft shape against softer shadows. Their breathing slows, not because they tell it to, but because there's nothing pressing it forward. Thoughts still come. One about tomorrow, one about something unfinished, one about how easily the mind slips back into old patterns. Each thought arrives with confidence dressed as reality. And each one, when watched closely, begins to fade on its own, just like the dream did. They remember how real the dream felt while it was happening, how unquestionable it seemed. There was no voice inside saying, "This isn't real." There was only experience unfolding moment by moment, until it wasn't. The same mind that created that world dissolved it without effort. This realization doesn't feel frightening. It feels oddly comforting. If the mind can create suffering so convincingly, maybe it doesn't mean that suffering is permanent. Maybe it doesn't even mean it's true in the way it insists it is. They don't push this idea too far. They let it stay simple. A thought appears, it feels real, and then it passes. They turn slightly, finding a position that feels natural, supported. The mattress holds their weight evenly. The blanket rests lightly against their shoulder. The body knows how to settle when it isn't being pulled in 10 directions at once. Another memory rises, one that usually brings regret with it. Tonight it feels softer, less sharp around the edges. They see it, acknowledge it, and let it drift without stepping inside. It surprises them how little effort that takes. They realize they've been waking up into the mind's stories every day, without question accepting them as facts, as instructions, as definitions of who they are and what their life means. But maybe waking up doesn't have to be so absolute. Maybe some parts of the mind are still dreaming, even when the eyes are open. This thought doesn't make them feel distant from life. It makes them feel closer to it, less trapped by interpretations, less burdened by narratives that never asked to be questioned before. Outside, a car passes quietly. Somewhere, a door closes. The world continues its ordinary movement, untouched by the worries that felt so heavy earlier. They feel tired now, in a clean way. Not drained, not overwhelmed, just ready. As sleep approaches again, the line between waking and dreaming softens. The mind relaxes its grip, no longer insisting that every thought be believed, every feeling be solved. They don't try to hold on to the lightness from the dream. They don't try to recreate it. They simply allow the mind to rest in not knowing which parts of experience are solid and which are passing through. The question from earlier no longer needs an answer. Whether this is a dream or not, they don't need to struggle inside it. Whether the butterfly was dreaming of being human or the human was dreaming of being a butterfly, the movement is the same. Things arise, things pass, and something quiet remains. Their breathing deepens. The thoughts thin out. The night wraps gently around the room. This time when sleep comes, it doesn't feel like escape. It feels like returning. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.